Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu unserem New Economy Shortcut, früher Juni 2025. Wir haben heute ein ganz spannendes Thema, aber mit einem ganz besonderen Blickwinkel, und zwar die historische Perspektive der Handelskonflikte. I will switch in English to continue the discussion. So we are talking about one of the big topics of today, which is tariffs, the trade war between the US and other countries. And we were very, very happy to have some insights from research recently, which is a study that has been made comparing this situation today, or mainly analyzing the situation in the 1930s. And so we very much look forward to this discussion to learn from what has happened in the 1930s. We are very interested also because there are a lot of other parallels between today and this time. So it's very important. I will say some words at the end, but just quickly, as we are 1 week before our next Berlin summit, the second Berlin summit, all these topics will come up at this summit too, and I will say just a word at the end with this summit next week. I hand over to David, who will moderate the session and introduce the speakers. Please.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. As you already mentioned, we are currently in the midst of a trade war going on. Even just today, there was announced a 50% tariff on aluminium and steel put into action in the US. So with these very high tariff threats and this trade war, and potentially also a currency war, sometimes, as the saying goes, the well-known saying by Mark Twain, history might not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So that's why we are very happy to have two renowned economic historians with us today. So I briefly introduce them, and then we can just directly start. So we are very happy to have Kirsten Wandschneider here with us today, who is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Vienna, where she teaches courses on economic history, macroeconomics, and international economics. And her research focuses mainly on the history and development of financial institutions and international trade relations. And then we have also with us today Carl-Ludwig Holtfrerich, who is an economic historian and professor emeritus at the Free University of Berlin. And he's one of the leading experts on German and international monetary and financial history of the 19th and 20th centuries. So very happy to have you both here. And I'll hand over to Kirsten Wandschneider, who will present her insights on the trade war, trade and currency wars, and the lessons from history we can have for today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for including me and letting me speak a little bit about my more recent and also ongoing research. I'm going to see if I can share the presentation. I have a couple of slides prepared just to introduce the topic and get us started on the discussion. What I want to say out front is that this isn't exclusively my work, but it's joint work with Chris Michener at Santa Clara University. And some of this is also based on joint work with Kevin O'Rourke, who is now at Sciences Po. So I'm mostly going to base my comments today on two papers. We have one on the Smoot-Hawley trade war, one on currency wars and trade. And then if someone would like to hear a German reference, we have sort of a summary piece with the Kiel Institute that summarizes some of the arguments of those two papers. Let me dive right in. You already mentioned in the introduction, people are very concerned about tariffs today, and the US policy actions are sort of the trigger for this concern. And looking back in history, people often cite the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill of the 1930s as sort of a cautionary tale. It triggered a trade war at the time. So if we're looking back in history and we're looking for examples that might help us understand the recent episode or put the recent episode in context, then people very often land with Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley is associated with the disastrous decline in trade in the 1930s. It's considered one of the contributing factors, not the only one, but one of the contributing factors to the severity of the Great Depression. Some people termed it as sort of the end of globalization, sort of setting a big signal away from multilateralism towards domestically oriented policies towards protectionism. There are some interesting parallels to the present, correct? This is a trade policy initiated by the US. When you look at the historical discussions, you find concerns about sort of fairness of trade, which is something that's been mentioned in the recent situation as well. Interestingly, Smoot-Hawley, as today, is sort of preceded by a period of sustained economic expansion. So it's not a reaction to an economic collapse. And what we see with Smoot-Hawley, and again, this has parallels in the current situation, is that there are very targeted responses by affected countries, including boycotts, including tariff measures. Again, like I said, very similar to what we see today. So what we do in this research is we basically provide an empirical analysis of this historical trade war to ask two questions. Do we see retaliation? And if so, who retaliates? And then do we see aggregate effects on trade from this retaliation? And just to give you a little bit more context on the historical details, people often ask me, so how did Smoot-Hawley come about? And I think the political context is different from the current episode. So what's important to know is that Smoot-Hawley its origins lie way before the Great Depression, so it's not a response to the Great Depression. It's already part of the Republican presidential platform in 1928. It's motivated by a protectionist sentiment towards American agriculture. Agriculture was struggling in the 1920s in the US, and agricultural tariffs were on average lower than industrial tariffs. So the impetus was sort of to try to support agriculture, protect domestic agriculture by raising agricultural tariffs. As Hoover takes office in January 1929, the US House immediately starts deliberations on a tariff bill. And here it's important to note that the bill very quickly moved away from agricultural protection towards much broader protection, which included agriculture, included manufacturing, many different sectors. The House approves legislation, passes its version in May 29. It goes to the Senate. It goes into Senate negotiations. There again, it's moved sort of a little bit more in an agricultural friendly direction, but provisions are added, categories are added. So it gets passed by the Senate. It eventually then gets signed into law by President Hoover in June 1930, comes into effect immediately. But what's important to know is that it is a rather wieldy piece of legislation. So there are about 900 tariff increases, about 200 tariff decreases, about 2,000 products coming into the US are affected. It raises the average tariff rate on imports that are tariffed from about 36% to about 42%. But it has a lot of variation on the product level. So different products are impacted very differently. Already during the negotiations to this bill, there is a lot of resistance both inside and out of the US. And one of the things we look at in our research is that already during the House and Senate negotiations in 1929, over 40 countries filed formal complaints protesting against the tariff, basically telling the US, please don't do this. This is going to have a negative effect on world trade. Please hold off. There's a lot of resistance within the US as well. There's this famous declaration of over 1,000 economists that actually appeal to Hoover not to sign this bill, but are unsuccessful. What we also see is that then in 1930, 10 countries immediately respond to Smoot-Hawley by increasing their tariffs on US imports, right? So their imports to the US, or the foreign imports coming into the US are immediately impacted by Smoot-Hawley, and then countries respond by raising their tariffs that would hit the US exports going to those countries, right? Many examples, Canada is a famous one, being very exposed to the US at the time and actually changing tariff rates twice in 1930 and then again in 1931. If we want to have a brief look at the countries that do retaliate, do respond, correct? We have 10 retaliators. These are the countries that are actually raising tariffs immediately in response to the legislation. And then we classify as protesters the countries that file these complaints, but don't immediately respond with tariffs. It's important to note, though, that many protesters do use other forms of trade protection, trade restrictions, right? So some use quotas, some rely on sort of softer tariff measures, campaigns, things like this. The key idea of our research is then to essentially say, what happens with US exports that go to countries that do initiate these protests, do retaliate, versus what happens to US exports to countries that are not engaging in this retaliatory policies. And this is just the raw data, but I think it gives sort of a good intuition of the mechanism that's going on. So the top purple line, these are US exports to countries that respond, retaliate protests. And the green line at the bottom, that are US exports to countries that don't respond, right? And what we're then effectively measuring in our research using sort of more complicated econometric techniques, relying on gravity models, is to say, how large is the impact? How large is this decline in trade that we're seeing in relation to these retaliatory responses to Smoot-Hawley? So if we want to sort of assess how damaging this trade war was, what we find is that it did not end well for President Hoover. We find that for the countries that explicitly retaliated with raising tariffs, US exports to those countries fall by about 30%. Countries that threaten retaliation, there we find that US exports to those countries decline by about 20%. We then look a little bit closer and see, can we find specific effects in product categories or in product groups that are important US exports? And there we also find that countries specifically target the large US export categories. And one interesting example, and that also has some parallels to today, is that we find that differentiated American consumer goods like automobiles, they're very visible. They're not as relevant for production processes, so they're mostly imported as consumer goods. There we find an additional decrease. So we see that these visible consumer goods are specifically signaled out and are specifically targeted. We then estimate that that leads to about a 20% decline in economic welfare. To the retaliators, we also find welfare declines for threateners and the US itself. For the US, this was really a story about self-inflicted wounds, correct? The trade legislation that was originally aimed at helping the US farmers just ends up shrinking their export markets and thereby backfiring. If you look a little bit broader at the interwar period, there is a lot that happens, but typically people have interpreted Smoot-Hawley as sort of a signal that oriented trade away from multilateralism towards more protectionist policies. We see an average increase of tariffs across the globe at the time. We see countries responding by reorienting their trade. So, for example, in the 1930s, the UK, its dominions and colonies basically start walling off their trade through a system of imperial preferences. So they have trade agreements that favor each other's products, but shield out products from the rest of the world. Other examples, correct? Germany retreats to the clearing system and sort of very focused trade with some southeastern European neighbors. Trying to respond to the Great Depression, Roosevelt tries to counteract this with the RTAA in 1934, which is sort of a step towards mutual decreasing of trade barriers again, but it's generally considered sort of too little too late, at least for the 1930s. We also see countries driving other measures. They are engaging in capital controls, they're engaging in strategic devaluations, and these further cripple trade. It's important to say here that these capital controls, these strategic devaluations, are not alone a response to tariffs and not alone a response to the trade fall, but are sort of part of a broader package of domestic policies that countries resort to in the face of the Great Depression. Generally, economic historians have pointed out that the 1930s was sort of a period without economic leadership. Kindleberger sort of termed this as no longer London, not yet New York, and especially the devaluations of the US and the UK as global economic powers signal to other countries that countries are looking inward more and are sort of ending regime coordination. And this question, what other policies are countries engaging in, then led us to the second paper, which I just want to briefly mention, namely, what happens with trade when countries devalue. And here again, we're looking at sort of aggregate trade flows. So we're not taking a one country perspective. We're looking at bilateral trade flows for a set of close to 100 countries at the time. So we're asking what happens when this currency war, and thereby we mean these competitive devaluations that countries are engaging in the 1930s, take effect, and how does that affect trade in this sort of bilateral gravity network? It's important to point out, I already mentioned the devaluations of Britain, the devaluations of the United States. We see over 70 devaluations in the early 1930s. So this is a large number of countries that engages in devaluations. This group of countries constitutes about 75% of global exports in 1929. So about 3/4 of pre-crisis exports are eventually affected by these devaluations. Again, monetary authorities target the exchange rate directly and do so for a variety of reasons, correct? So some of it is related to trade, but some of it is also related to trying to end monetary deflation, trying to de-link from the international gold standard. But the point for our research that's important is beyond these individual country decisions, which may well be strategic, the aggregate of over 70 countries devaluing ends the global monetary system at the time, ends the interwar gold standard. So then again, we're using our trade database and a gravity framework to look at what happens to trade for country pairs where we observe a devaluation. And what we find is that bilateral trade falls about 20% following devaluation relative to country pairs that do not engage in devaluation. There's some heterogeneity there, so we find even larger effects on the periphery. So there we see a close to 40% drop in trade. If we get fancier and put this into a general equilibrium framework, there again, it sort of confirms these results. The effects are a little bit smaller, about 12% on average, which is to be expected because we're looking at sort of a domestic substitution away from some of those goods. How do we interpret this decline in trade? Why did trade fall? Right? The currency war, these competitive devaluations represent a reversal of the benefits that we typically associate with fixed exchange rate systems, such as the classical gold standard, such as the interwar gold standard. The devaluations end regime coordination that was realized under this fixed exchange rate system. trade frictions increase, trade costs go up, and that essentially destroys the multilateral payment system. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And without further ado, I will directly hand over to Carl-Ludwig Holtfrerich for his comments before we start the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation, very stimulating. But therefore, I just want to add something which you did not mention, namely that, first of all, it was Republican policy of isolation, which started when the Republican Party and the Republican candidate won the presidential election in 1920. The Republicans not only cut down on immigration to the United States, but they also refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, which meant that they would not take over responsibility for what would happen, at least in Europe, with the treaty. The whole development of the interwar period would probably have been quite different if Congress had ratified the Versailles Treaty and the Americans would have taken up a leadership role in the Reparation Commission. Now, as to trade, the Republicans immediately after the presidential elections in 1921 passed the Emergency Tariff Act, which was a reversal on the Liberal Tariff Act that Wilson had introduced just before the First World War. And this was reinforced by the protectionist Fortney-McCumber Act of 1922. So throughout the 1920s, the United States practiced trade restrictions. Smoot-Hawley only added to those restrictions at a time when this was totally inappropriate because the Great Depression had started. I want to point out also that the American tariff schedule consisted at least half of specific duties, not ad valorem duties. And specific duties, those are fixed amount on a certain weight, let's say so many tons of, a ton of wheat pays $20, something like that. Now, when the prices fall, which they did in the Great Depression, and a specific duty on a good exists, then the percentage protection increases automatically. Now, it wasn't only Smoot-Hawley that increased the American protective tariff, but it was the decline of prices in the Great Depression also, which increased percentage-wise the American protection. Now, one point that came up in connection with the supply side approach to economic policy was an interesting point made in Jude Wanniski, The Way the World Works, a publication. He says that the decision of the Senate Finance Committee on the Smoot-Hawley tariff contributed or triggered the crash on Wall Street, because that was around the same time or the crash happened immediately a day or two afterwards. So I don't know how much weight this argument has, but in any case, I want to mention it. Yeah, you mentioned Charles Kindleberger. I appreciate his book still very, very much. And at the end, when he was explaining in the last chapter what contributed or what the US should have done not to sharpen the depression, he says for a leading country, it is absolutely necessary that they keep their markets open and not closed. Britain did that in the 19th century, kept their markets open. They should not, they should have counter-cyclical capital exports, and the United States did the opposite. They withdrew capital from Europe while the depression was going on, and they shouldn't have done that. It sharpened it considerably. And thirdly, they politically should adopt the leading position, which, due to their economic power, the leading country has. And the United States was definitely, after the First World War, by far the economically leading country, and they rejected, the Republicans rejected the leading role and rejected to cooperate, for example, in the League of Nations also. So here we have a classical case, what can happen when one leading country, Britain, drops out because of the First World War and the weaknesses that ensued. And the other then very strong country doesn't step in. We could be in a similar position because many argue that the power of the United States, international power, is going down, and that of China is increasing. So we'll see what happens there. But one last point, the second last chapter, before Kindleberger summarizes his analysis, is entitled Rearmament in a Disintegrating World Economy. And we do, at the moment, have exactly the same thing.
Okay, many thanks. Before going to the lessons we can draw maybe for today's world, I just want to maybe briefly spend a few minutes on talking about what are the differences compared to the 30s and today. One of the things you mentioned was that the tariffs were not ad valorem, but adding to the quantities. So we had deflation, so this might have led to even more adverse effects. Another difference I'm thinking about, and this is my question also to Kirsten Wandschneider, but also to you, Carl-Ludwig Holtfrerich, is that, formulating it openly, what other key differences are there, even though there are a lot of similarities between today's world and the world of 1930s. So, for example, what is with the US as the dollar reserve currency, for example, I'm thinking of, or also the political process you briefly mentioned, how these tariffs came about. Today, it seems it's more a top-down approach than a bottom-up, different particular interests subsuming into these tariffs. So maybe this would be my first question. What other differences do you see, leaving aside the similarities for now, maybe?
Shall I answer?
Maybe first Kirsten, and then you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yes. First, also, thank you for the comments, Professor Holtfrerich. I agree with everything you say, correct? I think it was very helpful that you outlined the 1920s US trade policy. And you're right. I mean, Smoot-Hawley is a continuation of this. I think in that context, I just want to highlight, and that brings me maybe also to today's comparison. So we saw that Smoot-Hawley on average increases tariffs by about 7 percentage points, right? Then we get this added effect through deflation. That is significant. So Doug Irvin from Dartmouth College, for example, has estimated that effect immediately on the US was probably twice as large as the tariff effect, right? So if you look at what did Smoot-Hawley do to US trade, so we're looking at the retaliation, correct? He's looking just as the US trade. And then how much did the deflation add? Then he comes to about a decline of US imports by 30%, where more or less he says 10% is the direct effect and 20% is the deflation effect. The tariff rates we're looking at today are much, much larger, okay? We're not talking about 7 percentage points. So that's a first note. And even the walk back that we've seen from announced rates to then reduced rates, we're still much, much larger, correct? We're at 10%. So that is a big difference. We're also starting at a very different point today, correct? Tariff rates between the US and the EU, for example, before this recent act of tariff making were less than 2%, correct? So back then we were already starting at a much higher level. Now we're starting at a very low level. We're seeing very large increases. Also, if we're thinking about the share of integration in the world economy, right? If you look at the US in the 1930s, imports were about 3% of GDP, right? So we're much higher today, somewhere around 14%, right? So if anything, we're seeing higher rates today, and we have a larger share of trade. If anything, I think that should make us concerned. One last point I want to point out again on the origins of the Great Depression. So the consensus of economic historians is that the 7% increase, the 7 percentage point increase in tariffs of Smoot-Hawley did not trigger the Great Depression, even though you're right? Then we could think about announcement effects, and there are some voices that are ascribing a larger factor to this, right? But I think it's important to note that Smoot-Hawley was not sort of the main contributor to the Great Depression. There were many other things going on, though it clearly was the wrong policy at the wrong time and contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. But it also was not a response to the Great Depression, right? Because it originated already in the presidential campaign of 1928.
Please.
Well, shall I now?
Yes.
It has been said that President Hoover, to whom I give most of the blame for the Great Depression, acted internationally in currency matters. He clung to the gold standard, but he acted nationally in trade measures. And this was wrong. He should have acted nationally in currency matters by devaluing the dollar early on, and he should have acted internationally in trade matters by not raising tariffs. Now, the main difference that I see is that we have the post-war world order established under the leadership of the United States, not only with the IMF, but also with the GATT, which is now called the World Trade Organization. And I think that the United States is in very bad shape because the tariff increases brought by World Trade Organization members are unilateral against the United States because it has violated the treaty of the World Trade Organization. So when Germany should actually next month increase some duties, then it would do so only against American companies and not against Chinese, Swiss, European companies, and so on. So a lot of the external trade of the world outside the United States will go on as usual. And this is quite a difference to the 1930s, because when countries reacted with high tariffs on American automobiles, it would also apply to other automobiles because of the most favored nation clause in trade treaties. And this is totally different these days. So I expect the worst for the United States. They will be most hit by the, and I wouldn't say recession, I would even say they are on the way to a depression. And we'll see.
Just because you mentioned currency wars, this would be one question to Kirsten Wandschneider. If you could elaborate a bit more on this currency war perspective also for today, as we've seen Stephen Miran and others in this Mar-a-Lago D'accord explicitly stating that this might be one of the goals of the Trump administration. And if I remember correctly, this only works even in their model if there's no retaliation, which of course seems, given your results, also a bit crazy. But so yeah, that would be my question. What's your take in this regard? And then maybe afterwards, one question to Carl-Ludwig Holtfrerich, because you said that the US is quite alone if the world acts against the US aggression and does not raise tariffs in between other countries. And so would this be a stronger argument for that there's no longer New York, but not yet Beijing in the future? So would you say, yeah, this basically leads to the demise of the US economy in the world economy? But yeah, first, Kirsten Wandschneider.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned this issue of retaliation. I mean, I think that is something that one can really draw from the historical case, correct? So in the 1930s, the US did not expect retaliation to the tariff policies. The current US administration has stated that they don't expect retaliation because the US is a large economic player. That was not true historically. That is not true today. We see that right now. In terms of the currency, I think it's a little bit more complicated because in the 1930s, we had sort of an international fixed exchange rate system. And what countries were doing is piece by piece, they were breaking out of this system. The general narrative has been that countries that left this system earlier did sort of benefit from a competitive devaluation, saw a bit of a recovery in their exports, and that helped them get through the Great Depression. One other important aspect that as countries were leaving the gold standard, inflation expectations changed. They gained a little bit of monetary policy autonomy, and that also made a difference. What we are showing in our research, and that's sort of in addition to those effects, is that, of course, then the aggregate crumbling of the gold standard did again reduce trade because it took away international stability and it increased trade costs. Today, where we mostly have a system of flexible exchange rates, right, with some regional exceptions, but we mostly have flexible exchange rates. I think the system is a little bit more dynamic, maybe a little bit more adaptable, and the US has stated this, right? They, at least Donald Trump, and you mentioned Stephen Barron as well, consider the dollar overvalued, right? We've already seen about 10% drop of the US dollar since January. I think if there is larger sort of active depreciation of the dollar, sort of initiated by the United States, then the question is, what are other countries going to do to respond? Are we going to see other responses? I think that's possible. It's hard to forecast, but I think it's possible. And I think if we're seeing large currency movements, even if they might not be as abrupt as they were in the 1930s, then we expect this to have negative economic effects. Yes.
Okay. And what about US hegemony, Carl-Ludwig Holtfrerich? You mentioned that you would expect it. Yeah, or go ahead.
Well, the Trump tariff policy is erratic. I mean, it's so erratic that a book just came out by an expert on trade policies, namely Richard Baldwin, under the title The Great Trade Hack: How Trump's Trade War Fails and the World Moves On. Now, I could cite a few titles of different chapters, but he says that normally tariffs lift up the exchange rate of the country that introduces tariffs because imports go down, and that strengthens the currency. But in Trump's case, the opposite has happened. The exchange rate of the dollar has fallen to my benefit. I'll be going to New York. It has become so cheap flying there and booking hotels. It's incredible. And in any case, the exchange rate has fallen. And I think it might have been a surprise for Trump also that the normal effect of tariff increases has not happened. But it is the insecurity about the political situation in Washington that triggers capital withdrawal from the United States and a capital investment, for example, in Europe. So this capital movement is overcompensating the exchange rate movement that normally would happen after the introduction of or increase of tariffs. So capital no longer is invested or less invested in the United States, but more in other countries, especially in Europe. Now, as to the leading role of the United States, whether this whole thing brings the shift over to another leading country sooner or later, depending on how European integration goes on, it could be Europe also, not only China. And but for that, we would need political union in Europe. We don't have that yet, but we'll see. I think the Trump episode will not be lasting. I guess that the elections, congressional elections next year will show that his policies have failed.
Kirsten, you want to add something to that? Otherwise,
No, I just want to pick up one thing where I completely agree with Professor Holtfrerich. Right? You mentioned no longer New York, not yet Beijing. I mean, why not not yet Brussels,
Yeah.
right? I do think the potential vacuum in international leadership is a call to action, and I think Europe should take that chance on a variety of matters, right? There's a number of geopolitical issues, economic issues that play into that, but I think we should not miss that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, also reflecting on this, one question which I had is basically the motivation for tariffs. And we have one question in the audience which also points in a similar direction. So I heard this in the context of the IRA. I mean, because you said also there was some continuity of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. There's also some continuity between the Biden and the Trump administration, especially regarding China. But so it's the national security argument, and then for the IRA and good jobs, bringing industrial jobs back, it was also the revival of industrial policies where maybe tariffs served as a kind of insurance. And the question of Jeremy Highway, I think, goes in a similar direction. If we have some social or ecological goals and we want to achieve them, then wouldn't this maybe be an argument to have a certain degree of tariffs or any other kind of industrial policy shielding basically these goals? I don't know, maybe CBAM or these kinds of policy instruments. What's your take on this? And so are there maybe national security or even ecological or this good jobs arguments which could justify tariffs or maybe other industrial policies?
Can I jump in here, and then maybe
Go ahead.
my colleague can
Yes.
add? Because this was mentioned before as well, that the Trump tariff policy has been very erratic, correct? And if we look at what Trump or the Trump administration has sort of given for reasons for this tariff policy, then on the one hand, we hear revenue, correct? This is going to generate billions and billions for the US economy. The second argument we hear is onshoring or reshoring of jobs, correct? Protecting American industry. And then we also hear sort of this deal-making, tit-for-tat negotiation. As has been said before, the tariff policy is incredibly erratic, changes really fast. It's important, I think, to point out that just these stated goals are already contradicting themselves, right? If I want to raise revenue, if I want to protect industry, I need to keep the tariffs in place, right? If I want them as sort of an argument for negotiation or a tool for negotiation, I'm inclined to remove them again. So there is a dissonance here right from the start. The revenue argument is in a modern economy essentially dead, right? That is not relevant, is not going to be very relevant for the US today, just because it's too small a number. And the US has another good revenue system with the income taxes, right? The sort of industrial policy argument, I think, is a little bit more complicated, and we could think about exceptions where certain tariffs of low to moderate scale with limited timeframes can be effective. This is clearly not what we're seeing from the Trump administration today. I mean, we saw the steel tariffs today, correct? I just read Paul Krugman this morning, right? The steel industry is relatively small. The steel tariffs of 2018, which are the most recent example, saved 1,000 jobs, but killed 75,000 jobs in the US economy. These are the estimates. So this is not going to be an effective policy to protect American workers or protect American industry. This tit for tat seems to be something that is very much on Trump's mindset, but it's hard to guess where that's going to go.
I want to point out that the tariff policy is only a marginal point in Trump's program. What is really behind it is this. I don't know whether you can see it. its mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, Project 2025 of the Heritage Foundation. The presidential transition project, as they call it, and it was published almost 1,000 pages in early 2023 already as a blueprint for the policy should Trump really make it into the White House again. And trade policy is marginal. In fact, there are 2 articles on trade policy in here. There are many, many authors with articles in there. All are close or were close to President Trump during his first term. Now, as to trade policy, there are 2 articles in there. One in favor of tariffs by Robert, what's his name? Russell Vought. He was the director of the Office of Management and Budget in the first Trump administration. He is for tariffs. And there is a second article by the Competitive Enterprise Institute director who is against tariffs. And that is, both are in that booklet. And so the issue is not really clear, but on other issues, this program is very clear. And it's a blueprint for a path in all kinds of political fields to an authoritarian regime instead of the democratic regime that shaped America during the last 250 years. And that there is the real danger, and not so much in tariff policies. I think that Trump is deliberately creating sort of chaos to impress or shake up the world order, including the international order. He would like the European Union to fall apart, while after 1945, the United States insisted that the European Union was formed, and without the pressure from the United States, this would probably not have happened. The European Payments Union was an American creation. The Montan Union came under pressure from America, and later on the Rome Treaty for the creation of the common market. So it's a complete reversal of international politics from Washington and from Trump. And I wonder how long he can do that.
Okay, so maybe let's spend the last minutes. And if we hope for the best and Trump hands over power peacefully, in the case that he or the Republicans do not get reelected, let's think about the time afterwards. And yeah, one important question is for me, maybe, I mean, the WTO didn't really work very well even before Trump. So I would say there's in global revival, some of industrial policies, maybe justified, maybe not justified. So my question would be, is there a political equilibrium basically away from free trade where there is cooperation and there is coordination and not this kind of erratic tariff and protectionist approach that Trump chooses, where we have coordination, albeit allowing maybe also for emerging economies to have some kind of domestic policies which are in line with global cooperation? Or would you say that the EU and Germany should now push even harder for the free trade as the WTO has it in his DNA? Kirsten, maybe.
I think that's rather speculative. I mean, as I said before, I think there is, one could think of instances where there is room for industrial policy. Generally, I think the world economy has been successful with more liberalized trade policies without wanting to sort of totally generalize this, but this was sort of the trend since 1945. I think it's very speculative to think about what comes after Trump.
Well, it is a fact that a lot of people in the United States have suffered under the impact of globalization because jobs went abroad. There was higher competition from countries like China, India, and so on, Korea, South Korea, and so on. But one instrument that was designed already in the Kennedy round with tariff legislation implementing the outcome, the results of the Kennedy round in the 1960s, early 70s, was trade adjustment assistance. And it seems to me that it wasn't really used as a tool to compensate the losers in globalization as it should have been used. There was not enough funding for it. And of course, you have to compensate those who lose by retraining them, integrating them into different jobs, maybe into a different sector of the economy, from the industrial sector to the service sector, which has been growing in the United States. Is the overwhelming percentage of the US economy is service sector. So why integrating former steel workers back into the steel companies in the US instead of integrating them into the service sector by retraining them or whatever, or just paying trade adjustment assistance and let them retire on it? Then they might be happy, But I don't give up the idea that relatively free trade, like within the European Union, and also within the World Trade Organization, is beneficial for almost all countries. Those who lose under free trade must be compensated, though, and that is an essential part of it. Now, as to industrial policy, I tend to think that by supporting future successful or maybe also unsuccessful industries, startups, for example, that can be unsuccessful. But in those areas, I think industrial policy is very helpful. Like the Airbus would never have been created if there had not been industrial policy to support it. But in other domains, especially protecting branches of the past that are dying off, their industrial policy is very harmful.
Okay, thank you both very much. I just want to flag that many of these topics we touch upon briefly will be also discussed next week at our Berlin summit. And I don't know, Thomas, if you want to say something to.
Yeah, just thank you to Kirsten and Carl-Ludwig and to David to have had a very inspiring discussion. Sometimes it's more inspiring than usually to look into history. It's always inspiring, but in this case, it seems particularly the case. And what David is saying is indeed we will have a session, for example, on how to design a more cooperative global governance at the summit next week on Friday, discussing what he alluded to, how a new world could look like, and integrating countries' wish to have certain industrial policies or certain protection or certain sovereignty issues, and then have a solution which is more cooperative than the current one. Just one thing among others, if you are interested and still not signed in, just referring to our website, you'll find the whole agenda and subscription and so on. So many thanks, Kirsten, Carl-Ludwig, David again, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.